I remember looking around, it's like, my kid has dyslexia, my kid has ADHD, and that's all that was. And it's like, well, that's really nice if your kid falls into a nice, neat package. But I have to be honest, most what I call complex kids don't fit into a nice, neat package. My kid had medical issues, allergies, and like there was all this stuff. And so I needed something that would help me navigate whatever was coming up, because there was always something new coming up. And then I had this next kid who was diagnosed with dyslexia, which was totally different from the first kid who had dysgraphia.
Welcome to Successful with ADHD. I'm Brooke Schnittman. Let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Successful with ADHD with my friend and colleague, Elaine Taylor-Klaus, who's a change maker, an innovator, and a groundbreaker, a voice for neurodiversity-informed coaching, and a guide for adults supporting complex children, teens, and young adults around the world. Elaine's a mom in an ADHD plus family of 6. She is a master certified coach and an internationally recognized thought leader in neurodiversity, coaching, and parenting. And she's a co-founder of the first global coaching organization for parents of complex kids, ImpactADHD and ImpactParents.com. She's a trusted advisor to parents and professionals, has trained thousands of parents and certified hundreds of professionals around the world in neurodiversity-informed coaching skills. The host of the Parenting with Impact podcast and author of several books, her personal favorite is The Essential Guide to Raising Complex Kids with ADHD, Anxiety, and More, which is the book she wished she'd had when she began parenting. Elaine is all about using neurodiversity-informed coaching essentials to empower families and professionals so that neurospicy individuals can thrive and reach their extraordinary capacity beyond their challenge. All right. So I would like to know, Elaine, as you have a family with ADHDers, I want to know how you got into helping people parent ADHDers. Like, where did all of the diagnoses come from? What was your journey like in raising a neurodiverse family?
I think the journey, like so many families, started with not knowing that I was raising a neurodiverse family and struggling with parenting and feeling lost. And, I worked really hard to have these kids. They were very intentional. There was it was not easy to get there. And then it wasn't going like it was supposed to go. The Kodak commercials were not showing up in real life. And I was really struggling, starting with my eldest kid, starting early, like weeks, years, like 2 years old, we already knew there was something that was challenging. And this is going back to the 1990s, but the first official diagnosis came at like 4 or 5 years old, which in those days was really unusual. So there was clearly, we were struggling. I was struggling. I didn't know. So I had one kid who was clearly having trouble. And when the next kid started also having trouble in school, and then the third kid came along, and it was like, okay, this is starting to feel really familiar. I laughed that I could no longer, it's like they were getting diagnosed like dominoes, and I could no longer look at my husband and say he was responsible for all of this neurology. Right. So
no more blaming the husband,
like it was definitely real, but it was just something wasn't explaining it. And I wanted to go back to school and do something to help other parents who were as lost as I was, because in those days, there was a lot of support available for kids, but there was nothing available for parents. I mean, that's very different now, but there was nothing. There was an organization called CHAD that had, if you happen to be on the right side of town and available to have a meeting on a Tuesday night at 7:30, then you could get some support. Otherwise, there was just nothing available. And there was this new thing called the internet that was, making it possible to get support differently.
When was this? How many years ago was this? I don't want to date you, but
no, it's fine. I'm totally open with it. I figure age is a privilege denied many. My eldest was born in 94. And I started really looking for what can I do to help other parents in about 2005, 2006. And initially I was working with a nonprofit organization in Atlanta, and I was doing parent education and professional education. I created an education series locally.
That's interesting that you were involved in parenting for an educational series and you sponsored that, but you didn't even realize that you were going to get into that with your own children.
Well, by the time that happened, I was dealing with it with my own children. And so that was my way to try to get the resources I needed. Like if I invited speakers to come speak, that I could hear them speak. Right. So I was really, there was just so little available that I was a little bit grasping at straws and trying to put together what I needed, because I had a kid who defined specific diagnosis. Like, I remember looking around, it's like, my kid has dyslexia, my kid has ADHD, and that's all that was. And it's like, well, that's really nice if your kid falls into a nice, neat package. But I have to be honest, most what I call complex kids don't fit into a nice, neat package. My kid had medical issues and allergies, and like there was all this stuff. And so I needed something that would help me navigate whatever was coming up, because there was always something new coming up. And then I had this next kid who was diagnosed with dyslexia, which was totally different from the first kid who had dysgraphia. It was just, it was constantly changing. And it became clear to me that the central place for managing the change wasn't them, it was me. Right?
Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
Did you know at that time that it was you that needed to make the change, or did it take you some time to realize?
Yeah, that took a little while. I knew I needed help, right? I knew it was falling on me. And in those days, my husband was early diagnosed, but we didn't know what treatment looked like. I wasn't yet diagnosed. So everything was falling on me. And I just needed help. And I needed, for a while, I didn't need a therapist. I needed a Sherpa. I needed
Tell
guidance.
Me what to do, guide me.
Right, help me. And so two things kind of happened simultaneously for me. One was that my child psychologist, there were so many diagnoses that I went to her in tears, and I said, where do I start? And she said, you start with a metabolic. And she sent me to a nutritionist who in DC, I live in Atlanta, who specialized in really complex situations. And within 10 minutes, she identified gluten. And this was so long ago, I said, what's gluten? And she told me, and I cried. And we had psych testing being done at the time. So it was such a dramatic change so quickly that we were able to do pre and post evaluation, and things changed so much that she ended up in a book by this nutritionist called The Bipolar Child Who Wasn't. The chapter was about my kid.
Wow.
So that was really dramatic. And then my husband, I also took him off gluten at the same time. And it was like this fog he'd lived with all his life lifted. So we had this metabolic shift that made them receptive to treatment, available to treatment, if that makes sense. And again, I do not believe that everybody who has ADHD should eliminate gluten. Didn't work for me, but I do believe that sometimes if there's a toxic load, if there's something else going on in the system, it can make it difficult to really avail yourself of proper treatment. So that was one thing that happened. And about the same time, I was trying to go back to graduate school to help other parents. And I went through the process. I took the GREs, but to do that, I figured maybe I should get myself assessed too. Right? Because all these kids had all these issues. And it turns out that I was diagnosed with learning and attention issues in my early 40s. So that was a bit of a surprise, because I was a high achiever and I had been fairly successful and I kind of pushed through in my life. When I was diagnosed, I looked back and my whole life made sense. Like there were plenty of signs, but who knew in those days that women had ADHD? Who knew that high achievers had ADHD? Like it just wasn't... now I knew where my daughter's dyslexia came from, like it all started.
The fact that you had to go to DC to find a specialist in the complexity of the ADHD.
Well, actually that was telephone, and she wasn't ADHD. She was nutrition. Right.
Okay.
Um,
But still.
but still, right? It was just the whole time. Like I look back on it now, there's so many more resources available for people. And now, so think mid 2000, early 2000s. Now we start having this thing called the internet, right? And so we went off of gluten in, I want to say 2004. And by 2007, I couldn't find a graduate program that met my schedule with small kids. And so somebody directed me to coaching. And so I thought, okay,
Mm-hmm.
I'll do this as a stopgap measure so I can coach parents until I can go back to graduate school. And I went to my first coach training and I called my husband that afternoon in tears. And I'm like, I found it. This is it. This is my calling. This is because it was so clearly what I'd been looking for. It was a modality that was empowering and positive and
Mm-hmm.
looked at opportunity and possibility, and it wasn't so deficit based. And everything up until
Mm-hmm.
then had been about what's wrong, what's broken, what's missing.
What do I need to fix?
Right, what do I need to fix? And I had these amazing kids who were smart and creative and interesting and funny, and we're pretty smart and creative and interesting and funny, and it's like
Right.
we're not broken here. So and
Exactly.
so when I discovered coaching, it was like that became the modality. And full disclosure, I am a nutrition school dropout. I did try to go to nutrition school, which was not the right fit for me. But coaching very much was the way for me to begin to get my head around it. And then the bonus was when I became a coach, I became a much better parent to these complex kids.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't rocket science, it was better communication.
Right. That collaborative problem solving, the listening. And I love how you also said that like coaching was your thing. There's just, and I'm sorry to
You're
interrupt,
good.
but there's just so much to go into when you say that, because with ADHD, yeah, you learned you had it in your 40s. Very typical now that women are seeing that they're diagnosed later in life. And with children with ADHD, we know, and I know it's more complex than that for your household.
Well, for most households, really.
Correct. Yeah. But we know that by the age of 10, you receive 20,000 more negative messages than a neurotypical. So for you to learn that as a coach, we're not looking to necessarily fix your life. We're not saying that you're broken, right? So you're working with the strengths, you're working to empower your children,
Yeah.
and them having you to help them at a young age is everything.
It was huge. And it was just and it's funny because my husband is now also a coach. He's an executive coach. And a couple of years into the journey, I turned to him and I said, because it took a while for him to get on board with what I was doing. And I looked at him and I said, what happened? And he said, I just couldn't deny anymore that what you were doing was working. It was just it shifted the entire tone of our home. It shifted the way our
Mm-hmm.
kids saw themselves. And and when I look at how it impacted my youngest child versus my oldest child, right? So my oldest child, by the time we really got into this, was about 12. So there was a
Mm-hmm.
lot of not handling it well before we learned to handle it well. My
Sure.
youngest was 6, so he was raised in this very coachy environment. And the difference, they're very similarly wired in a lot of ways, but the difference with how they approach themselves and the world is really different. And you can look at gender. There are all these other factors. I'm not trying to say this is a research thing, but the difference, his emotional intelligence and his capacity to accept who he is and how he's wired from a very early age changed the course of his life in so many ways. Right? When you
Yeah.
believe that you can instead of when you believe that you can't. It's
It
it
changes
changes
everything.
everything.
It's that growth
That's
mindset.
right.
And that I think goes into the big talk about, is ADHD a superpower or is it a deficit? Well,
Yes.
I think we know it's, like I believe, if whatever I believe it
Yeah.
is, right? So if I believe it's a superpower, then it's a superpower. If I believe it's a deficit, then it is a deficit. So your mind is so powerful.
Mindset really matters. And then I have a middle kid who's now in medical school, right? with ADHD and anxiety and dyslexia. And so it's been a really rough path to get there. And her capacity to own it without self-judgment, without self-blame, to be able to acknowledge the deficits, let's call them, I prefer challenges, the obstacles, the different ways in which she's wired that make it harder to be able to acknowledge it, get the accommodations she needs, ask for the help she needs, advocate for herself without shame around it, but to see that she's got this amazing way of thinking and learning that really makes her it's going to make her an extraordinary doctor, right? And the compassion from having to overcome what she's overcome in her life will make her such an extraordinary doctor. And the understanding that it's not enough to just tell someone to do something, that medical adherence doesn't come from telling, it comes from enrolling and inviting them and helping them find a path for themselves. Like when we have this next generation of doctors coming up and medical providers coming up who understand what it was like to overcome those obstacles themselves without shame, what a difference that's going to make, right?
Yes. I just wrote an article today about my daughter. I finally booked her first dentist appointment.
Yay!
She's 2.
Yeah.
And her pediatrician understands ADHD. They specialize in ADHD and neurodivergence. So as an adult with ADHD, she's been telling me for months, okay, by this time, you need to book her dentist appointment. So every time I go in, she goes, did you book it? No. Did you book it? No. Literally, it's been a year. So our last appointment, she said, by her 2.5-year appointment, I want us both to have her dentist appointment booked. Can we do that?
Oh, I love that.
And I said, yes. And literally yesterday, it's been on the back of my mind because with ADHD, unless it's written down or you actually have it scheduled to do it, it's on the top of your mind, right? Like it's just as important as everything else. And I booked it. And of course, it didn't take very long, but we know that having someone in our community who understands ADHD, who understands we might need some external accountability and supports that rather than shaming us is huge.
Yeah. Yeah. And then now you've got the capacity, because now it's booked, you can begin to prepare your daughter. You can begin to there's all this other pieces that make simple things in life a little more complicated. And that doesn't mean they're impossible or that you can't or that they're obstacles. It just means we sometimes have to navigate regular life a little differently. And that's okay.
And that's the argument as a previous special education teacher, everyone needs an IEP. It's not just special education students, right?
Sure.
We all need to differentiate.
Yeah.
None of us learn the same.
Yeah.
So why try teaching the same?
Yeah, I totally agree.
Fast forward, how old are your children now?
So my kids are now young adults, and my youngest is 23, my oldest is 29, and now I have a daughter-in-law who's 35. So it's a whole different world. And so of course now I do a ton of work with parents of young adults, because what I've learned about my journey is I'm always supporting other people kind of on my path. And I think that's how I navigate my path, is to, as I'm getting my head around it, is to help other people do it too, because that's how I learn. And it's not like I'm some brilliant guru who knows what they don't know. That's not what it's about, which is why I love coaching. I just understand the context of what they're dealing with, so I can kind of hold the space for them to figure out what they need to figure out and guide them.
And what about your kids at 23 and 29? Where are they as far as feeling empowered?
It's a really interesting question. Back to that, like the difference. The 23-year-old doesn't know what he wants to do, but he knows he's going to find his path, right? And I think he's really clear. And what I've always kind of said about him is, I don't know what you're going to do, but you always land on your feet. And he kind of knows that about himself. He'll figure it out. The 27-year-old is in med school and is on a path, right? Doesn't know what kind of doctor she's going to be, but she'll be a damn good one, right? And the 29-year-old has been really successful
Mm-hmm.
because they're an actor, and
Mm-hmm.
they kind of hit it young at 18. So part of
Mm-hmm.
what happened for us is when we stopped trying to fit our kids into the box, we started
Mm-hmm.
meeting them where they are. This was a
Mm-hmm.
kid who was just not going to learn in a traditional environment very well, but they were amazing. And so
Mm-hmm.
they had a different path. And when we started supporting that path, they started being successful. So they've been very successful in their career as a young adult. The last couple of years between the pandemic and the actor strike has been really hard. So we're kind of in this place where they're rebuilding their confidence, but they've got a foundation to stand on, right? And P.S. They were recently, finally, at long last, diagnosed with autism as well.
So I love how you said that essentially things aren't linear,
Mm-mm.
but they have the foundation that you and your husband have helped them build. And even as an adult, as a coach, right? We can have all the tools, we can have the foundation, and we're still going to meet the challenge and we're still going to fall on our face
Yep.
sometimes. But we're going to rebound a lot faster because we have the community and the tools.
Yeah, I like to look at it as spiraling forward. Like it's not linear, but we do move forward. Progress
Mm-hmm.
happens, but sometimes there are, dips and valleys, and then you hit the high points. So I
Mm-hmm.
think we spiral forward in life. I mean, I think it's life. What I have always said since I became a coach is that what I want for the people who work with us is to have what I call a bring it on attitude, right? Bring it on. Whatever's coming at me, I got this. I want to be able to swing and know when to swing and when not to swing and feel confident in handling it. And that's what I want for the people who work with us because life's going to come at us, right? It
Yes,
doesn't, it's not some even smooth sailing for most people. Life's got dips and valleys and ups and downs, and it's complicated. We need to not try to solve the problem, but to learn how to tackle and navigate the challenges as they come forward in life.
exactly. And that's also building executive functions for us.
Yes.
It's building the executive functions for our children.
Yeah.
If we're the heroes all the time for our kids, we know their executive functions are growing until age 25, sometimes
Yeah,
30.
I was going to say closer to 30 for our kids.
Right. So if we're being their savior all the time, it's going to take them a lot longer to build those skills.
Yeah, rescuing them is not what they need. They need us to be in a constant process of problem solving with them. And it's not so that parents become their kids' coach, but it's so that parents have the skills they need when the kids want them. And there are many times, especially in college or high school, when my kids would call and I'd say, "What do you need from me right now? Do you need a mom? Do you need a coach? Do you need a poor baby? Like, what do you need?"
Exactly.
And let them guide me in what kind of support they need, because that's how they get empowered to feel capable and confident.
And that's hard too, as someone who coaches or someone who's in a teaching, mentor, therapy type of role, to ask your child what they need and not try to solve it for them.
Yeah.
And as adults, very often what we need from our significant others is just an ear,
So
right?
true. Or from our friends.
I don't want you to solve my problem. Just listen.
Like what I love about coaching is about being in a conversation with yourself. And when we talk about it, when we process what's going on, that's how we figure stuff out for ourselves, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And with ADHD, so many of us are verbal processors.
Yes.
So it takes us a while to get to our answer. And if someone is saying, you should do this, or, oh, how about this, or he stops you in your train of thought, it can really stop you from feeling that
Yeah.
empowerment. Question for
Yeah.
you, something I've noticed, especially in high school boys. I have a 13-year-old who has ADHD. He's very smart. I've worked with middle schoolers and high schoolers with ADHD. I have the parent coaching training. I am a parent, right? I have ADHD, all the things. And I can't even tell you, as far as my experience and what I've heard from others, right, is like how, as a parent, and I'm curious with your methodology, what you do here, do you empower your high schooler with ADHD or your late middle schooler, not become their savior, but still make sure that they get what they
Yeah.
need?
It's a great question. There are kind of four key areas. Probably two most important things for parenting tweens and teens is one, to manage the emotional dysregulation consciously, ours and theirs, to understand that that emotional dysregulation is there, that it's real, that they're not being rude or disrespectful on purpose, that they are, like Jeff Copper always says, talking to a teenager is kind of like talking to a drunk kid on the Bowery. Like you just can't, you got to understand that this is their brain on hormones, right?
Mm-hmm.
So part of it is not taking it personally and understanding and really down regulating, right? Managing the nervous system, managing your nervous system, helping them learn to manage their nervous system. Don't try to problem solve with it when anybody's triggered. Like, number one rule of thumb is commit
Make
to
sure everyone's
calm in
calm.
the whole family, right? And really do the
Yep.
work around your work around calm. We do tons of work with parents around managing triggers, and ours and theirs. So I think that's probably the first. And then the second thing I would say, it's really important to pay attention to how the messages you've been sending all these years, probably unintentionally, around asking for help. Because as parents, we get really upset that our kids won't take the help we see they need, right? But what's
Mm,
happening is when we see they need it, that's our agenda, not theirs. And
correct.
we've probably been sending all these messages all these years, like, you should be able to do this on their own. And then when they want to do it on their own, we say, why won't you take our help? When in fact, we probably set the environment in motion to have them not want to accept help, because we adults are pretty lousy at asking for and accepting help.
You think?
Yeah. So that's, I think, the other place to really look is to be honest with ourselves about what are the messages we're sending. And instead of getting mad at them for not asking for help, look at what's in it for them and help them find their reason, their purpose, what's the value to them, and help them begin to see how it serves them instead of setting it as an expectation. Because nobody wants to be should on, and our kids
Mm-hmm.
need to be asked, not told.
Sure. I believe any communication needs to be done in a place of
Yep,
calm. And I also believe that we have to get to the root of the why of our concern, because we have a million
yep,
concerns with our husbands, with our
yeah,
friends, with our children. What are the important
yeah,
ones? I love the down regulating emotional regulation. I have a 2-year-old, as I mentioned,
yep.
and we're working on that.
Well, and it's funny, we tend to be really good with it with preschoolers, and then we kind of lose it
Yes.
when they get to elementary school.
And with
Yeah.
ourselves too. Treat ourselves like a baby. I say that all the time, right? So once you have the emotional regulation in the front of mind and you think about the messages that you're sending as a parent, right? You think about being speaking in a place of calm, collaboratively problem solving, all of the things, right? Generally speaking, you get more of a collaborative solution. However, I'm curious about your thoughts on rewards,
Mm,
on consequences, expectations.
mm. So there's a lot in that question, right? As you know, most important thing is to set it up in advance so that people know what they're working towards. And rewards are perfectly reasonable. If a kid doesn't have another intrinsic motivation for something, and it's something they really need to get done, and they're not resisting it. They're just having a really hard time activating and getting it done. And the external reward makes perfect sense. You want them to be part of creating what that reward is, and you want it to be reasonable. It's not you're going to get a car when you turn 16. It doesn't have to be outrageous.
That's not a reasonable reward.
Well, who knows? But external rewards are valuable. Natural consequences are effective when we articulate and identify them in advance, when our kids are part of identifying them, and when our kids are part of identifying what happens if you don't hit that, right? So here's an example. I'll try to make it really simple. When my son was in high school, I had a battle with the school because he was a really bright kid who was really motivated by the teachers he was motivated by, and we know the story, right?
Of course.
And there was it wasn't AP at this school, but effectively an AP history class he really wanted to take. And he's a real history guy. And he had a bad history teacher his freshman year who was a first-year teacher. And so he, didn't get straight A's in history. And so they weren't going to let him go into this AP class because he hadn't had, right? Oh. And so I said, let him in the class and then let him prove the rest of this year that he can stay in that class if he keeps getting the grades this year. And they said, no, we're going to make him get the A this year. And if he gets it this year, then we'll let him in the class. And it was just clear they didn't understand motivation. And they didn't understand the way that an ADD kid needs to be motivated, because if you do okay now, then we'll decide later, was not going to motivate him enough because he didn't trust them to let him in the class. But if they had said to him at the beginning, okay, you get to take this class, now you have to keep earning it, he would have worked his tail off, right? So, because then he would have had a piece of it. It would have mattered to him. He would have known while he was doing it. He would have trusted the process. And so with these kids, particularly as they become tweens and teens, agency is really important. What we want to do is foster their sense of agency. We want to transfer ownership to them so that they're beginning to take the lead and we move into more of a support role. But then oftentimes what happens, so we teach these 4 phases of parenting in our sanity school class. And often what parents do is that they direct, and then kids become teenagers, they start pushing back and parents go, okay, fine, you do it. And they throw themselves out of it. And the kids are not set up for success. And they move into, okay, you do it, hands off. What they think is championing them. What they're really doing is waiting for their kids to fail. And then the kids fail, and then they come back and they say, see, I told you. And then they justify going back into director mode. And what our kids need as teenagers is for us to be dancing between collaborating with them and supporting them, collaborating with them, let them take the lead and supporting them. And most of parenting, effective parenting with these kids is going to happen in those middle 2 places.
Yeah. And I would say for any of the parents, thank you for that. That's really helpful. It's a dance.
It's a dance.
It's a constant dance. You think you're learning, you know your kids, you understand everything, you're perfect. And then the next day, boom, hormone X just hit it. Or you just got into a fight with your girlfriend.
Or they may have a capacity here, but not here. And so this one, they may be ready to do it all by themselves. And this one, they still need your collaboration.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to know for us as adults, right? If we're getting coached, right? Change is not going to happen overnight. We know that, right? So how do we expect that to happen for our kids? And I had a recent client who cares so deeply about her child. However, right? And is saying to the child, okay, I want you to be independent. I want you to learn these things, right? And before the first meeting, I get a novel of an email that says, he didn't do this, he didn't do that, he didn't do that. And it didn't even get started yet. Yeah. Like, how do you expect change to happen, right? And I understand how exhausting and nerve-wracking it can be to kind of take the reins off a little bit, but we do have to let our children with that dance.
Well, and if we don't hand them the reins and let them practice it, they're never going to learn to guide it themselves. And if they know we're holding the reins, they're going to stop trying. Because why should I
Yes.
bother? If I just don't do anything, my mom's going to come back and tell me how many assignments I've missed. Why should I
Right.
bother?
Right.
Right?
Yeah, that's great. So, Elaine, you have courses, you have books, you have coaching. What would be the best way? And I appreciate this conversation as a neurodivergent parent, as a neurodivergent coach. What would be the best way for people to find you?
Well, I think what we set up for your community is a free gift, which is a great way to kind of download something, get into our world, see what kinds of resources we've got. So we created a gift for y'all at impactparents.com/successful. And
With 2 L's, right?
2 L's, successful 2 L's, yes. And it is a free chapter from one of our books, The Essential Guide to Raising Complex Kids with ADHD, Anxiety, and More. And
Love it.
we have another book called Parenting ADHD Now. Those are kind of our two key books. And then we teach a class called Sanity School, and we have group coaching, and we're doing a summit this summer. We got all sorts of great resources. And probably the best place to start is at impactparents.com/successful with 2 L's. Successful.
2 L's.
Yes.
Awesome. And with the couple of minutes that we have remaining, what would you say is your number one success tip for parents of neurodivergent children? Don't give me 5. Number one. This is hard.
Actually, it's kind of easy. The change you want for them starts with you. Like, for real, you think if you have an hour to spend, $1 to spend, that you should spend it on them. And if you really want to help your kids, and I don't care if your kids are 4, 14, 24, or 44, however old your kids are, the place to start is really with you getting your head around, how do I get myself, my anxiety, my everything out of the way so I can be fully present to meet this kid where they are and help support them in what they need. Because if I'm in the way, it's about me, it's not about them. And parenting is actually about them, not about us. And so we've got to do our work to get ourselves out of the way. We've got to get the support we need to be able to do that effectively.
That's so good. I love that. And I think any change always starts within the person, right? If we want to change our environment, we can't control what other people do. We can only control ourselves with awareness, with practical empathy, with the tools for communication, with the understanding, right?
What I like to say is you can't control what happens, but you can control how you respond to what happens.
Yes.
And you can be reactive or you can be responsive. And what your kids need is for you to be a conscious responder to whatever is going on. And that starts with you.
Responsive, not reactive. Well, thank you, Elaine, for coming on Successful with 2 L's with ADHD. Always a pleasure chatting with like-minded colleagues. Go to impactparents.com/successful with 2 L's to get Elaine's free chapter of her book.
Thank you for having me, Brooke. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Successful with ADHD. I hope it helps you on your journey. And if you need any additional support for you or a loved one with ADHD, feel free to reach out to us at coachingwithbrooke.com and all social media platforms at Coaching with Brooke. And remember, it's Brooke with an E. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.